Lochlanich. Ham fachgol heen y crwchig jalaf de yiddanich borob, le clehevan, y cthachig cael sybi y hic na nwy. An y iatrin y Lochlanoch agos canatw yn yr oniorbe, had haum as y rod bio anitje, maar lien y Lochlanoch. Fadde fasgir 3 chiad bliana, y tosiachig ag jiddig yn ochgyflin, agos y lentyn chon y bliana mile sysga to sia. As y chiad dolomach, fyg no Lochlanich y gyrig do yn paganoch, sed gydail y cthitsin, yn jyg y marag yn y blar, gymy sli hyleddachge, chwn y be yn joy y fas an y Valhalla. Ach, gyddoch na dda chiad file bliana chyn go cthich, hosich cthiasteach gysgwylig na misg, agos chron nu fi an awn, y sion bas fornierstoch. Ach a creinachyn yn y ffyddnych fioich Lochlanach sio, iddi fel ymyrag as yn hwrsgalen yn ys chilioch y dola sialw, yn cymys di sgialach gan naclynir cho trich. Ma faddanich Lochlanach, efo llast cho lagyd, misnachol. Be Guðríður Þorbjarnardóttir, yn gan y boddanich yngdach Lochlanach sio, y rwgig an yn ynys Chile. Anitje tron y linsyn mar yn Taistealaiche. Be'n iach siwyl y bydanes na mianwysyn, yn nyn y foddanach as y dŵl, a chai gotchid môr nor yn Iorpe, agos go costichyn môr hydd a meddygau. Hiol Guðríður tasyn y chwan hir och tusyn, agos iddo Taisteal bydan y bwloch, rannig I sylfŵr, fasgydd coi ciad bliana, ro Christopher Columbus.
We don't want to take too much credit because there have been many other female spacewalkers before us. This is just the first time that there have been 2 women outside at the same time. And we do, of course, want to give credit to all of those that came before us. There's been a long line of female scientists, explorers, engineers, and astronauts. And we have followed in their footsteps to get us where we are today.
Guðríður should be known as a great explorer, equal to the Viking explorers, the men explorers that we all know the names of, Eric the Red and Leifur Eriksson.
When you read the sagas, they are about her. They trace her history much more, and she's the one that the people who wrote those stories really cared about. They cared about her history, her life, what she was about, what she did. And it's also clear that Guðríður is the person who is really the woman who was traveled, who had seen the world.
Ha urskelven inis Chile a genef jalaf ma ith bea yn Taistealaiche. Snatuschen jöndach a vegigianef. Ha de brien ith vodschen kunnerstoch gan a Greenland. Ma chanjeven nach de hache ddiaf dde le tusanich môr hydd a meddygai. Fara de rugig a machge Guðríður. Agus tuschen heddefachol y Chile gan a Roniorpe ith yn teach fôr Lochlanach eichge. Ha unnach einich an eilawn de cwjach, man a turis mageddig eichge gan a roi. Fasgydd jyddig y be. Ha larichin twniochi o lyn y Lochlanach a chai o ddorog an y talaf yn eisg agos inis Chile o'ch yn gaddig y ffailchach ag fisrach ag asŵr man a haddys yn mianwysach sio. Sio sgialach yndach Guðríður. A hannig o gachi irisio sa chosyn clwgi hen mar un gan y Taistealaichen y bwdane an y niatri. Rwga Guðríður an y ninis Chile yn cheis mian lyn y Lochlanach Gyddoch ran y fil y bliana. Gyhyndach ha cynachyn ag ysgialach gan tron y gynnyddachyn a ha tor sialion dy hwyl fatas na Lochlanach iddyn cwmalas na hwrsgalan inis Chileoch. Fad idd ysgrifag eith crach gan ddwy as y darna sydd tresaf lyn giag. Sientolaf gisli Sŵrson un gan I hawddachyn ys eremole y hwn yn hwrsgalan.
The sagas of Iceland are unique in the context of medieval literature in the sense that they tell of the fate of ordinary people, not just the high class of society, coming together with a different cultural background, Norse paganism and Gaelic Christianity, trying to build a new peaceful society in a new virgin territory. And they are written by people of that culture in their own language, in a literary style that is much more modern and like the modern realistic novel than It is like current medieval chivalric literature of the time.
Ha Guðríður yn nochgag am na da llawn wrskal. Wrskal mwyndio the Greenland agus wrskal Erik Rúai. Le chéile anisje mar wrskal in Greenland wat yn neramachag yn joid sydd fôr lan crein fianna agus fian jerken. Yn danig Guðríður agus y company siŵl tasyn awns yn tŵl dŵr. Getach yn y wrskal yn sio ysgrifig le jiffer skrifet edyn han y priaf hachartasen na beheg o iddo fôr y cael di chéile.
The saga that tells us most about Guðríður is called officially Erik the Red saga. But when we read it now with our literary glasses, we see that it's not constructed at all about Erik the Red, around Erik the Red's character or life, but it's constructed around the life of Guðríður. So if we were to name the saga now, we would certainly call it the Saga of Guðríður. She was the most attractive of women and one to be reckoned with in all her dealings. So that's where her story starts.
903.78.
903, okay. And what's our north thing? I'm trying to get to 196 about.
209.67.
We're still that far north?
Yeah.
209, okay. So.
Fat cor agus jeich bliana ha buon big dodwch science a meddygau agus in Chile iddi fi co oprachig gos Skagafjord guledd ysgrwdig. Sian y jara fjord an y canna tua in Chile far y ro Guðríður steiche ag jedig y bea. Fawddwch science y rasach ag pat ein twniochi le fi gael sampl yn talafin agus y cloch trainsich yn giachin agus florog a dachlog ymlan hadol y ddash chon y nwn y flin giag.
We are looking for the center of the 11th century longhouse or skáli in the field here in Granddaughter, just east of the old farmhouse. This is the longhouse from the time that Guðríður would have lived here from the beginning of the 11th century. According to the excavations and geophysics, it's over 40 meters long and 6 meters wide, which is a fairly big building.
As joi'n obertáiseach a dhégianamh ag sean huachan is Gleimbar far a rád a cloch traisiach yn giachin, lorog a look science rudigin ioendach.
It was unexpected to find completely unknown buried Viking Age structures just in fields. You know, most of the Viking Age structures are visible. Like if you want to find a farm, it's there, it's a set of ruins. But here, there's so much soil that accumulates down in the lowlands, it can really erase them. There's nothing to see. It's just field. But one of the main things is that this is where the story says that she and her family come back to when they return to Iceland after living in the New World. And they say that they bought land at Granddaughter, which is where we are. And this house down here in the field is the one that was current with that time period and appears to have been rebuilt in the early 11th century, just about the time they would have moved back. So this is as good a place as any for her to be.
We were doing this in almost absence of the sagas. In fact, when we discovered this site, somebody, I forget who it was, said, "So you found Guðríður's house?" And I said, "Who?" So I had to go and read that particular saga. I didn't think the Vineland sagas had anything to do with our study of a settlement pattern.
So I think she's sort of come into her own as the main character. And of course, you know.
And she's a fantastically dynamic character. Center of house.
Center of house, excellent.
Should we go find some ends of the house?
Yeah, I think that would be in order.
Okay, so we're 21 meters this way.
Ha ceinir na ddochlanich nio mwyndir ddochlin mar ha trich gyda'n eramachig ysyn droch hiwsien is forniost, ach coga ddyddef y fans na dyn sio.
The Vikings were a fierce lot who came from Scandinavia. In around 800, they seem to have developed a new technique of shipbuilding with the keel that enabled them to sail in exceptionally low waters, so they could navigate rivers, come ashore almost anywhere. and make their attack swiftly, get what they wanted, and flee on the next tide. So they had no difficulty or problem with violence. They thought that if they could go and get what they wanted, they would kill whoever was in their way. We also know them as traders, of course, and settlers and artistic craftsmen and so on. So they explored the entire European area that could be accessed from sea and rivers. They served on the guard in Constantinople, and their ultimate defeat was in 1066 when Haraldur Harðráði, king of Norway, fell when he got too ambitious trying to invade England and conquer it in 1066.
Rúga Guðríður an an inis Chile, ach banna éðin agus alape a bha síseach. Hannig a sinne bhí bhíl a bha uair na gnuasal tarsin chuan hir ef seach lochlanach na ráil, cútid I bári vala clia údúr, hug súse agus talabga na ddarannig at inis Chile. Tre údúr a nín sin gáin banna gasgach lochlanach ile a héad a heramachach ar san húscalin. Héich a bhári chuachgach a bala clia ag inis Chile van na hilan an alapanach, le buan de gachiad gile neach Cádia. Han Tolaf Andrew Jennings for all haine gealtach agus na Nilan a tsekis giachtri chuchleidioch viarstioch lín na lochfanach an an alape.
Ha a chlach híirech seo enimichtje mar chlach an rí, agus ha jan in Denmark field, ha rí töf balabig lankerti, tua ballamór fiarst. Ha a rag a veli a chorachug ue rí lochlanach, a cha a varaag an een battle oorskillig en ageen an alpenach. Han taatje seo ag 4 chrie sjaun rioch en crinjach. Noor a geldes sin ash gu och gevlien, garo alpe, maar a ganjige sin in Jue, ietsje raun. Ha either jub urga, either the deep-minded, a hennemchug mar seo ska a glichtisch. Doelgisch in is chilig, daar een ien kjaun kinje voor gasten hier niddevi, rischen kan kettel flatnibber, no flatnose. Hanneke goed teuf schier na halpe, agus gansige in Chegaul fat. Een jeref roelgisch, fas uider, Oliver hin kwiti, Olaf the White. Hannik gewien rie, riech lochtenig de la klie. Maar goed Olaf groen vlienlig in schechet, aan een duich en krunjach. Vjuge uider van de horslees. En J. Baas Olaf, vjuge aan een suiig koekelig, or wat naaitjen erinach is lochlenig mijn koerstjare. Agus doelges in is chielig, grunjigi, tjaulig, aan zijn rodeunie seur is tralian, maar wie wil, schenner Guðríður, agus calerie mach Thorstein Ruider, red, hechi in Chegaul. Sjontag mun de hurigheid aan in Chegaul is een groen vlienigjen, or bij leug moor van een Thorstein, maar aher agus genne roye. Agus calerie Sigurður the Mighty, hier de archiv, groeige rioch aan een kjaune toe in de halpe, kus een jech vra, agus kus een de varav nam alpenich
Ag an naam seo waar ddíadach dorog ein inis Chile, huad ódúr Tseche va ornast coci an na néðin agus an na alape. Jéimigi áte fudich savage dorog. Jori gydjag seach mór lochlanach a hogal an na alape, agus bise captje na teich a chaig inis Chile, Cad se bhuian fór van a cos, na misc sienedd Guðríður.
Chanel mór an feestergiaking mi ein wievel, schenner Guðríður. Ach, mus roe na hrail, feuter vi kindjoch kun bij dunje oesel vaun po hoes. Bij je groen geunje a gai en legel seur le uider. Leki seur kutjoch erp, erenro enem krunjoch. Agus van de wach eerle, agus nien rie erenach. Gav uider rie wiefit, agus erp aan zijn eundai, bij wie het torst verrenrijf aan een inis Chile. Bij borrenoch nio avestjoch van een uider, zo'n linie. Fáide visneach gaichte, fallaf gus furuch an dúichúr, agus fáide vis ora is gundo górstich I bátich in hain. Huki goró I an kunust, en jay baas a Caelic, is mach agus gavi cémanan gus I hain a yian levi a fakal alapa. Fa I dana agus iontach mar an ro eiche rivi kalame an kaluater firin. Iontach mar an ro a scéalach na vrosnachuga ginjalachian mar Guðríður a hanig na jay. Fa uither gema kutramach an a bialarish inchitjede. Agus is kindjach gumbiog Guðríður scéalach na chluintjin muéin.
Guðríður was born here on the tip of Snæfellsnes, probably somewhere in the land claim of Laugabrekka. This place here is called Laugabrekka. Her grandfather settled here. Her mother died sometime when she was a child. We don't know exactly the story because that's not in the sagas. So she lived pretty much all through this area.
Han tutor a meddyganoch Nancy Marie Brown iddo gan yr hi lorich yn ysgrifig mae ioen yn ddochfanoch, y ga yw mae fe Guðríður.
Guðríður, I call her the far traveler. I'm not the first person to give her that name. She was given that by some other scholars earlier in the century because there were some men of her time who were called the far traveler, and they didn't travel nearly as far as she did. She's the first woman to go to North America from Iceland, probably from Europe, and the first mother of European extraction in North America. She lived somewhere in Canada or the United States for about 3 years and had a son there named Snorri. And she and her husband and Snorri came back to Iceland and lived here and had many descendants. So she's a very important person in the history of Iceland, but also in the history of North America.
Tron y pliannych yn trasio an yn unis Chile, yn oedd efo Guðríður has na paustje, ba arachymedyn edrych nabion cwmande. Ysgon ffwyddoch bio, iem je yn hw gan arachymedyn gael. Yr eid addys, ha ahedd Guðríður Þorbjarn, mach fi fil yn tral hwyf sŵsio, edd anachig mar gynnig gymalodgydd na ingin, a ha gian is y tos taich gan yn ynegge. Nid a hai júltug y chiad dynnu y gwydig I ffosig, mach tral ele hwyf sŵsio, ha Þorbjarn y gael tŵn y hynegge. Char omwr an charajynegge y fat lwga, ach na misg va Erik Thorvaldsson, y va anigje, mar Erik Ruach.
Guðríður's father was a good friend of Eric the Red, and in fact one of the few people who supported him when Eric was outlawed.
Eric the Red is presented as a troublemaker in the texts, so there are two conflicting origin stories about him, but they are all consistent in always presenting him as getting into some conflict with his neighbors.
But the connection with Eric the Red was very important because Þorbjarn, Guðríður's father, was one of the few important men in the area who actually protected him from his enemies so that he could make his great escape and discover Greenland. So there was a very strong link there. Þorbjarn was willing to put his life on the line for Eric the Red.
Ha Erik Ruach e ddwyddoch a inis Chile yn jyg a nabi y farag, agos esga sio hedol edfod sy'n gan y Greenland, ysgon atje tunnach I alfarog y sien. Agos heg ysach y 3 plianna y siŵl chymichel yn sydd fawr a ha sio. He Chile gygynis Chile leis yn leach gyfel y 2 hwyr fan rhywun sy'n fian, ach gyfel fjorden doinan a ha uania agos tarinoch.
The news all around was of this green land, where the land was there for the taking, and it was lush and it was beautiful. And of course, they didn't really know what it looked like. We hear that, according to the sagas, Eric the Red was a great salesman, and he had decided to give it a good name so that people would go there. So it seemed like it might be a good idea for him to go to this new Greenland, where his friend Eric had promised him a farm, and to give it a try. Things aren't working out here on the tip of Snæfellsnes. He didn't, mostly because he sided with Eric the Red, he didn't have a lot of friends on the other parts of Iceland who had outlawed Eric. So he didn't really have an opportunity to move to somewhere else in Iceland. And for some reason, he didn't remarry. We don't know why. But he decided to give it a chance and go to Greenland. And we think Guðríður was about 15 when they set off.
As na bhain sin, be rúta na bhain, a bhí genefan turas tasin a chuain a inis Chile go Greenland, fiús is jo bha, a charo Guðríður agus a clúa iad forstanach leis a jíide. Seach nach rogú fábharoch, chai in Chile galad bharn an taun fat a dhauri. Riad amach a bíag agus isce, svasich tar gan a bheith borst.
Guðríður and their crew are shipwrecked before they reach Greenland. So they are shipwrecked on some little island off the coast of Greenland, which must have been a perfectly terrible place to be shipwrecked because there is nothing in sight. You can see the big glaciers of Greenland and the icebergs in the water, and you can't get to a shore where you can find anything. So they were pretty much out of luck, having been shipwrecked on this skerry off the coast of Greenland. And here comes Leif the Lucky, and this is how he got his nickname.
Na the híle gan a Greenland, and join turas eke go Vinland, Voich Leif Eriksson, mach Erik Ruoi, gan a long vristje, agus gandal, havele Guðríður van a skid. If skach o train se ve, hoe de farerem a vardes gubrach, Leif and Jo Orstein. A Jew, and in his Chile, haar haast de kritchen, go be Jo Orstein and Danwood, ma haveles du kutjekin ek moed. Rein Leif Eriksson, Anichtje, maar a chiad Jorbach, a chai go mór hyd am meddegai, tar tussen mare heen. A reid na uskalen, hannig eith chyd an the nilan yn niad na halape ek yn naum. Far a leid a chorach a gun Jew an the núg, an the nilan loish.
Sé jachtri Leif Eriksson heen, gynach groedan lí gan y Grönland, agus gynach seachas roe chud focús, agus gynanig nehir tíð Vatican an the hill. Agus gyn gwyddichers an trisag, hannelism fóseach coiú groe di bonnach an the hill, agus gro mac etje leis vannach sin. Hannig cymig bod Leif Eriksson an the hill tro buan an the Seattle is an statien. Chud rope heen ha brolioch na statue ga Leif a chud gan a chulahat is na landige. So have ferris Roland like me for an the Niravi for an the Ninistil. Agus sé seo nearfaiad an Miniskaul. Has an tolit gele an the hill. Agus ha úl fóreg dúneán agus gosán heán. Agus ag luchtúris gudioch has an gma tolit gele acan an the hill. Dynne edach gal.
Ha common jatri uig a genef tar gan a ceallich an lochlanach as a skide, trona fys talish geramon, borst talish glochlanach an a mianushin, a chai a lorag trai sa skide. Ha mach savalje idda chumalas a daitaski. Ha dualchas na lochlanach saleth an an tar de geraman archin a skide.
En man een haatje of course als een kolderen haast, maar lekker niet aan de heel sé mangstra, sé tuhannes magnes aan de heel, aha tor, hule hule ballen aan de heel, agus en man kutjach gesse es na baltjen.
Han tolf aveste mach giljevain, na jodige ermen aatje na halape.
fachgal ha gyma cwmynta an ynyman yn ache an yn alpa agos an y lochlan sy'n fachgal Vig agos se wg a hacking yn Gaelic fararo fachgal sy'n lochlan ach sy'n gachwyd i'r ynym sio leid wg lewish agos wg yn ylun sgia yn ich agos eisiau bled eile an y lews gwtach cymia fag agos gyda hiad fast yn ynym sy'n gyfel sy'n i gielhwch bag a cwn mat gybig. Agos bag sy'n fachgal eile hannig ysdiach dan y Gaelic as yn tian lochlan is. Ha ynym yn ache lochlnach eid fieg alapa. Chan anan y tish mian halapa ach gaharid is costichans gaharid as sich an y tŵa agos tef sir na halapa as na hilanad. Agos coed na hynnyman as an arsyniach mae'r palt y had sawnys ache y far siawn lochlan ys mae'r chan yn wael as na hadach yn sy'n mae'r rialt gyma farsing. Hyns gyfel na tŵs yn cho gawn na dy fringe sy'n eid yn neu flin agos yn jeich flin. Siad na hynnyman yn ache ys cwtrmich dar y hicac o gremich eid echtri yn lyn sy'n. Yn da chwch yn yma yn ache agos archaeolas.
Ha Guðríður y ganioch na che chyd y ialu a has y Greenland. Han y smwant yn eich gytwndach go archach yn ysadjedd falaf idd yn chwli ymrag fo lef jo orstein. Y rawsich costynier môr hydd a meddygau ron y sio sy hwg na Hermanlan, Hedgerland, Markland agos Vinlandydd. Fo Ilan Baffin agos gwtjes gan y Gulf of St. Lawrence an yn Canada. Na badjedd orst, ffos Guðríður braidd lef Torstein, agos colag hogad na siŵl chwn yn thyliwdd iddyn thyfyniar, chwyd droch hyd y far na cwsiad, agos gyddyd y jaigaf chileg an y grwlain, fa Guðríður y chielig y corp y ceile ydd.
One of the other interesting things about the sagas about Guðríður is they have a lot of folklore and superstition and magical happenings in them.
Everything that we would classify as supernatural was natural in this context. There is a seeress or a prophetess that is called upon to come and tell the future because of terrible times that people are having in Greenland. She needs for the magic to work a certain song to be sung, but no one knows the song except for Guðríður, who learned it from her family back home in Iceland. Varðlokur, it even has a name, Varðlokur, and we know from Gaelic Scotland the idea of warlock poems.
Well, Guðríður is Christian. She and her father are both Christian. And she says, well, I don't really know if I should. I'm a Christian woman and this is a pagan ceremony. And so she thinks about it and she talks to the seer and the seer says, you could still be Christian and do this. You're just helping out some people. And so she thought, well, I can help them out, make them feel better. So she sang the songs.
Ef mér verður þörf mikil hafts við mína heift mögu. Ef mér fyrðar bera bönd að bólimum. Eggjar ég deyfi minna andskota, býta þeim hvorki vopn ég vélir, svo ég gel að ég ganga má, sprettur mér af fótum fjötur, en af höndum haft. Þá kann ég rún að rista, þann kann ég galdur að gala. Þá kann ég rún að rista, þann kann ég galdur að gala.
And we are told that no one had ever sung them more beautifully, that she had this lovely singing voice. And it's one of the only details we have of what Guðríður herself was like. I mean, she is standardly beautiful, or she is wise or intelligent, but this is the only little personal details, that she had a lovely singing voice. And of course, the spirits flock around and tell the fortune of various people in the house, including Guðríður herself, who is going to have this magnificent list of descendants that goes down to several bishops, which is how it does turn out, of course. She was living in what they call the Eastern Settlement with Leifur Eriksson after she was widowed. And as a widow, she had more rights than as an unmarried young woman. She could have a say in who she was going to marry next, or even if she was going to marry. She could inherit the property of her dead husband. So she was a very wealthy young woman, no matter which saga you read. And she was probably only 17 or 18 years old at the time anyway. At which point, an Icelandic trader named Thorfinn Karlsefni from Skagafjörður comes to Greenland with 2 ships.
Karlsefni comes along, fine merchant from Iceland of the highest possible birth that country could provide.
I imagine that they may have caught each other's eye. We don't know, but since Guðríður had the power to say no, and she didn't, we think that she probably liked this young man from Iceland, this Thorfinn Karlsefni.
The 2 of them get together and ultimately get married and start planning on a second Vinland voyage, and with the intent to settle there in a new land.
And yet the saga is very clear that people started talking about putting together another expedition to Vinland, and Guðríður thought it was a good idea and wanted to go. And it's very clear in whichever saga you read that she had a lot to do with the planning of this expedition.
Ba Guðríður schon a grúnlainakal, charo au nach magana ríchi a dinne ec an naumschein, ba schon a go Vinland díist, a sjolig unwedile tron a huskachen a va chokunnerstoch in turis magidig. Han a huskelen torst imre gain, gedrein Guðríður, Karlsefni, agus an skippe vorachke, en turis go morhid am middegai, an a 3 seichen lochvanoch le gadesen. Reina de schlie tua go Ilandisco, Farajach a tashin jes go Heduland, Sanoorschein, a nu go tu sher hine jes go Markland, gusidranik at stocha Ilan Bale. Fask e de fies a sacha tua de halveneesk. Fara rodarne brahe de kleef, e de vi fudoch e kaum believe, ache anichte Jew, maar lons o midu.
Lons Meadows is the only authenticated site, North site in North America at this point. And we know from the size of Lons Meadows that there were as many as 70 to 90 people there.
She priaf archaeological te jatri lochlanach a has an olive Brigitte Wallace an a morhid a middegai. Vaina parch gan a skippe a dhorok nich an lochlanach ek lonso medu tras na shisketen, agus gavi parch as a hiad chloch archaeological.
Lons Meadows is in a very unprotected area, very non-typical, very close to the sea for one thing, and it's in a very windy spot. From what we can tell of the radiocarbon dates, we trust they were there around the year 1000 on either side. The closest we can come is about 20 years on either side.
Chai fianish de go per earin agus op het fiug a vorop as na strechen lochlanach a seo. A tos taich gan a viach go roch lochlanich a carag nan seichen ach geheen. Ha fianish ga leech a ceal gleva, dis a naam e de vil immerag as na hurskallen. Han a tokallichen agus na rute na chael vorok ag lonso midu a tos biach kein. Gere aatje was seo schon vaadjen lochlanach gunnend huiluud. Gael zich een kloch tokalich een foutje, de gianne vle fremich een fiug. De tokal as een neugoi, visje nagin had die vorok aus de gruwlein agus in is Chile. chai 3 10 fata cwtid I bog yn y slwy o ddoro cwtioch. Ha ceine fa ag yn oddaf gwolus, iddo dda o ddoro gysgibau clych yn rwydys ingeniche, fiasiach ddochlanoch iddo chlachgach o sion cloi yn niaf.
And I looked at it, and it was a typical Viking age spindle wheel. So for me, that was a great experience. I mean, people always ask us, especially on large excavations, are you finding gold? Wouldn't it be exciting to find gold or something? And so, but a spindle wheel like that is much more interesting than that because it tells us something. And it tells us that the Norse were there, and it's a typical Viking age period. And also, the people who were spinning were the women. So we knew women had been there. We later learned that most of the artifacts certainly had been created by men and were attached to men. But there were women there too, and that we knew the moment we saw it. And that gives some meaning to an artifact. That's what we are after. And the archaeology confirmed, really, the people who came were men, with just a few women.
So the fact that a spindle whorl was found at Lansom Meadows means that very likely a woman was there, and there's no reason not to believe that it was Guðríður herself. So we have these connections between the sagas and the archaeology, which are quite fascinating.
Chai croen imig vo chrúf chrorangoch o ddorog an y straen lochfanoch an y hio. Chanil croen imig cwmande an y talafanisk, yrad 6 kilometr i'r ffolaf, i'r tyfynier chan y jes Lansomidu, in y clatich yn y jes as y Gulf of St. Lawrence, an y Canada.
Butternuts were found in the Norse layers, and that is a big discovery.
Ha sio tos biach wajid gain, gyda galaf mwndid yn Chile na satid jes, jidach mar a hedd eisiau as yn hwrsgalen. Va ilan y ffnwse agos New Brunswick van chryfyn chro imme, agos fian jerken fioich. Be Sean Turver hwg leif yn terem Vinland i den arche, chid yn ione.
And it led me to conclude that Vinland, and especially the good part of Vinland where they could pick wild grapes and butternut. It could have been farther south, but as far as we can see from Lansom Meadows, they did not come in direct contact with indigenous people right there. But if they went to New Brunswick, they would have come across the biggest native populations in all of Atlantic Canada. And these people were the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, who had populated these areas in New Brunswick, where the butternuts and grapes grow, we know now, for at least 7,000 years.
Sienne Mi'kmaq túsanich a has de fudoch an y ronin de Canada di tyfu chwan hier.
The land is about equally densely populated as Western Europe at the time. So if you come with 3 Viking ships and set up camp, you're bound to meet a lot of natives.
And again, I will the Bahan gis cooked at Pahalam. And this is game of the Chiji Hamish, the Gagas, Manmoloch, the Gay.
sé ceann cíní a hanna dhalle Paul, fer stúdí na duine migma a ha fudoch fasgedafin Miramichi an New Brunswick.
Our people were very close to nature, close to the river. The river was their stronghold, and we survived from season to season, where we fished and gathered and hunt. Our people were very spiritual connected, and they had a lot of visions, and they would see these people coming, and they would warn the other people, but they would know they were on their way. Yeah, they must have seen the ship. They thought it was a big bird or some kind of a big winged bird, and because they could see the sails, but they didn't know that was a ship. They thought they were very strange-looking creatures.
Ha gana trí imrian as na húscalan, ma vratan, fé, cryniach, fian yerken fioich, liapagan cylor, Jón agus muchan mare, a hullig iddi vi tachast idna túsanich a meddacanoch. As na vajan trasen, vig mundid in is Chile a malast in na túsanich, a va karstal, agus ekro ui as na dúne le krachen sulle, a hannig aster gam fechkin.
Dalw sy'n?
Ég heiti Guðríður. Hvert þitt heiti?
Ég heiti Guðríður.
Guðríður is meeting a native woman saying, ég heiti Guðríður, my name is Guðríður. And the native woman repeats back with exactly the same words. And this has caused some philological difficulties because people were looking at this in the manuscript and this is a mistake. The scribe has made an error here. But once folklorists come and read this story, this is exactly the kind of joke that came up when Europeans were exploring the world 500 years later and meeting all kinds of native peoples, and people had no idea about the other language. And this is what would happen. People would be repeating phrases. The sagas, more or less, I think, showing us that this is a genuine memory of the confrontation with a totally different language that didn't understand a single word. Because in the European context, the Vikings were moving between different languages, but they always had an interpreter. And so once they get to North America, there is no one to help them.
Chwyf Guðríður agus y dynechge Karlsefni cwtio ddys eich ddwachgym, siach y 3 bliona as y tŵlŵr, y rawsachig na chyd y torichse. Chaiad got jes siach y dydd chyd Vinland leif, gw fjord strwach le elaneg y fial, far y dyhyichat yn cawnbe. Ec yn awmsyn, fa mach ge Guðríður, agus be snori yn terem y hwg i hen agus y Caelic. Y hiad fastio ddiaf le sisdach giorboch, y rwgig an y môr hyd a meddygau. Víte a tarchachat leid clá agus crachgan bheoichin ga chéile trích. Háisich na túsanich a medacanach a gal ui as an naramach írin a bheith eganlúch táil. Ach, chud a duine Guðríður casc iad malart aramach sa bí étar an dá bhuiin. Bheith mundiad in is Chile a tavan banne gan na túsanich a medacanach gotá, iad ro tar lúach na misc. A charáir chá Taistealaiche leis a bharlast cháirstal seo, na nach rá banne a sin duine túsanich.
And when they were offered that milk, they thought it was a good gesture on their part and to make maybe peace and friendship. And when they drank that milk and they got sick from it and they got angry and maybe they thought they were being poisoned and then took action and said, we're gonna let you know that wasn't acceptable.
And just at this time, there's a great noise outside. One of the Vikings has killed one of the Native Americans. They had been, trying to trade. They'd been trying to, make some kind of arrangement. And the American reaches for the Viking's sword, like touching it. What is this thing? Can I have one too? And the Viking kills her. And of course, they run away. The woman runs away. The Vikings are going, okay, now what do we do? And the next time the Native Americans come, they come as warriors. They don't come to trade or to see who are these strange people in the boats.
Because our warriors back then, they were very fierce warriors. They were very powerful warriors. They were very tall. They were very strong. And when something like that happens, they really can do a lot of damage.
The Vikings are vastly outnumbered, and so they manage to escape from this battle, but it's clear that they can't stay.
Mustag at the Sulur, ya Guðríður na sacha jes bulach, for a jachat shachat the Rua Ray Wan Fee, a ha torst Cape Cod Gurninchin, Rua on the crew doing, ha stoppagamach vo Massachusetts of Aju, agus na stachin uniche. Ach Gershon maha, nach de chumna loch van ich or aroundsache. Jay chud statara of a tunnach gas a tul tarunach of a show.
As the stories remember this, first it's a very risky business. They go with 3 ships, only one returns. So from the perspective of the investor who is going to take the risk of exploring these lands beyond, this is the chances that you are faced with. You lose 2 out of 3, and no one is willing to risk their money with that. But they also have a memory of the encounters with the native population, that even though they are friendly at first, they finally clash and they fight, and they more or less have to run for their lives, the Norsemen, because they are, of course, outnumbered by the native population.
Unlike the Europeans who came in the 16th century, they didn't bring any disease. They didn't change indigenous culture anywhere or their lifestyle. They came and looked and left.
Enjoy the Guðríður and Dunnechke agus amach gog snorri runachig and sulur akad. Reina the Schliadash tashin chuan here in Nirivi. Unuach gra down, reichgat yn baid anasach y hwyddat an y môr hydd a meddygau, sraniad forstan gapin. Mae iddych, chwyd yn Taistealaiche ywndach sio, agus y tseulach y hwyl fat ys fashin, criach ydy tyrysachge, le fod sy ile, eddash y gynnes Chile. Be sio yn chiaf tyrys e Guðríður y dol tashin y chwan hir, ach fa tylyg has dy hyn. Dynig Guðríður agus y Tealach fwyddoch fasgyr dach I Tealach yn dynechge an y Skagafjordur, an y canna tŵa na dŵchym. Chwyd y hynaf y sosial dy eisial ywnig iddo maedd Caelic, gys y dŵad I iolus na biar idd niast persy Guðríður, y chanich di mach as y Greenland. He iddo ra gyda hog Guðríður agus Carl Sefni yn dachiach gyhyn an y Glaimbar. Gyjara fe fa ffeimydd barach rŵm, o'r mynawn sy'n fa mach Caelachge, Torbjorn. Yn joi bas yn dynechge, hwndau Guðríður yn nesio y chyn fasgydd jedig y be chon eich ddidjaf chdiastol. Ach fai hast gymor y mianachig y fi na Taistealaiche, maar y fai ydy fi fat vlionichen.
They had in Skagafjord 2 farms, at least. They had re-enactments and they had granddaughter. And apparently she got along with her son Snorri very well. Because she decided, after he married, she gave him instructions to build a church on the farm at Granddaughter, and she decided to go to Rome to visit the Pope and to become a nun.
I think one of her most important travel was her walk down to Rome. Because she didn't do that with her husband, or there was no guy that took her there. Yeah. She walked down to Rome.
Yeah.
And that is really important with the whole idea of early Christianity. She became an anchoress and sort of solitary worshipper.
Chabe touriste y fawn o fi siwla inis Chile an y canna tŵa yn y Rhaenorpe yn nŵl gan y roi as y nidelt as yn y flin diag. Gyda gyda fath gach tŵ gan tourist co yw 3 miasyn. Chanel na hwrsgal yn y gysio mar y rawn Guðríður sio, no jed tli ag afi. Ha cwt ysgolydd yn iddo ra gyda doch o gyda hiol i alwochlyn yn tosioch yn nŵrsynt go jes gan y roi y gal slien ilerach y fa anichtje. A chan holof Jennings y ra gyda marcha gyda gaf Guðríður sliet yr ialitje, siachat yn y hilen yn y nier, chydd chdiastal y sienar fi fil.
Chanel sy'n ceintioch, je yn slie y gaf Guðríður nŵr y chai gan roi. Ach, stoche, gyn jech I yn un rad sy'n jech sienar. Sias tron y helenen, agos yn wrsyn, gwerin, josasen, mwstw chwmi ore gan roi.
The story says that she also made it back, which would have been, quite an amazing journey, walking most of the way. And she lived her last years at Granddaughter as a nun, whatever that meant. But it meant that she was an independent woman, that she could make decisions about how her farm was to be run. The farm was to be given to the church after her lifetime, but that apparently was fine with everyone in the family. And she lived out her life there. And we don't know how long she lived, so she might have lived a long time, or she might have died soon after she came back from Rome. But that story has been preserved in the sagas and by her descendants for hundreds of years before it was written down. So it probably has some truth to it.
Nu dda fad y cloch, fasger tŵa hynnes Guðríður an y Skagafjordur, hwyd y skipol vorok idd crafen van nyn y flin diag. Fydynnych agos boddynnych y fyg ma cheisyn Guðríður. Stoch y ffiws gyda caratyn y fawnda.
Það náttúrulega þegar maður að grafa upp leifar mannesku að þá fer maður ósvöld að hugsa hennar líf og hvað gæti mögulega að hafa á hennar daga drifið. Og þessi herramaður hérna að hann gæti allt eins hafa verið á skipinu sem Guðríður fór á til Vínlands og komið tilbaka. Hver veit?
Han lochlanich, a kjankel alpenich, ri soul nan lochlanach. Ha ko echkri akin, ri inis Chile, agus lochlan. Gehechriel, ha bui voor, ek na lochlanich alpe, sna mian ocean. ha dúil chaintjin arcah is healtain lán je achgal lochlanach. Agus gyderf bawn mu 1800 chai norn can an lochlanach healtain amach abi. Hayet een gynioch a chur aan een lán gynchil na halapa.
And when you start piecing together what she did, she ends up being an extremely attractive and adventurous and strong woman. Probably, I would say, one of the best examples of a saga woman, because she just does so many things that are so difficult to imagine that a woman could do, and she pulls it off so easily. She does, she crosses the North Atlantic 8 times, and few people did that even once.
You would hardly be able to achieve that on a sailing ship and on foot in the modern world. It would be exceptionally costly, and it would require a lot of determination that I don't see in any individual of today.
Hanna Vorchen Guðríður as an nunne vlin giag, car colach the tussen spede dedden as a laju, dunne train id nach hilmor an jakil, ach a jeligis the kunnerst ma hiken an raad, le ames koosje wichken dunne urstoche. Stoche gejit urskal an ure skrivig ma gunig a leech, spinne hermelen achgesen id geinig braag. A ju surin gan a chulle dunne le shiesdach in is tiloch, de gol edash trichet ginnelach, se fiaven a chal, de Guðríður Þorbjarnardóttir. Schon boddenoch a hannig vo heulach iddisil, le sheneth van a rhaal, hued as bia na tupest mare, a chael na fydd ag roi poste, hued siachet id imig braun, yn y sliet tro hydden nach rot dyn y ioddach, ag ro a chiad fastje, rugig an yn nameddigau, ach le paren den jorboch. Y gan ich sŵl mar atje fioich nach ro mor an ioddasig dynne, ach yn y slietje michelydd gysafeltje, y gan yon sien, va behe mar harstelige vodden, y hwyl yn taster y batje an de line lochfenoch. Gidach, jöndach.